working on building up that soil biology, that microbial community. I should say as well, chemical disruptions should be avoided at all costs as well. Chemical disruptions, herbicide, pesticide, even synthetic fertilizer is pretty hard on the soil. I know it's really tempting when you get an insect pest outbreak to go out there with your spray and just start trying to eradicate them. But the problem with that is I kind of think of beneficial insects or insects as like a macroscopic version of the soil microbes. What you're going to end up doing is killing off all of your beneficial insects, and you're not going to have any lacewings, ladybugs, parasitic wasps to keep those pest populations in check. And the thing is, if you want to have the beneficial insects, think of them as like, they provide ecological services that you can't go and buy. I mean, you can go buy beneficial insects technically, but I mean, you can also just plant some pollinator habitat, plant some native flowers, and attract them as well, and get the benefits of those living roots in your soil. So the thing is, to have those beneficial insects, you do need a small number of the pests because that's what they eat. So if you eradicate all your pests, you're not going to have any food to attract those beneficial insects. So it's really about keeping that in balance. And a lot of the soil health presentations I go to kind of glazes over the beneficial insects and the pollinator habitat. But especially for us vegetable growers, I'm here to say that that almost needs to be added. It's like the 6th soil health principle is to plant beneficial insect habitat. Because, like I say, you're going to get the ecological services of those beneficial insects. You're going to you can create, so the one, before I get into some strategies, which is what I kind of want to do next here, is just the 5 soil health principles, just to review that. Keep living roots in the soil, increase crop diversity, keep the soil covered. So that can be with a cover crop or with mulch, or I even use tarps or like billboards actually, and I can talk about that a little bit more as a no-till strategy. Let's see, keep living roots in the soil, reduce soil disruption, and then lastly, incorporate livestock. So I know that's a tricky one for us vegetable producers, but that gets into things like using composted manure, which you do want to use judiciously. I mean, you don't need to go crazy with manure. You can actually get a buildup of phosphorus in your soil if you're over manuring. So just be judicious. If you have good soil microbiology, you really don't need to be adding a ton of fertilizer. So any questions before I go into a few? Yeah. So I can talk a little bit about what I've done for cover cropping, but and I do have some handouts here, which I'm happy to pass around, and I have one specifically about cover crops. The important thing is to find out what's your niche. So is this your spring niche before you're planting tomatoes, for instance, or peppers or whatever that might be? Is it a summer niche, like after your lettuces have come out, or is it a fall or winter niche? So figure out your niche. Where can I squeeze in a cover crop? And cover crops have a lot of benefits. I mean, buckwheat can double as a pollinator habitat. It's also a fast-growing summer cover crop. It's also very easy to terminate. So when it comes to cover crops, another thing to think about is how am I going to terminate this cover crop? In other words, how am I gonna end this cover crop so that I can then plant something? I like to be no-till organic, which is kind of the gold standard. I'm not saying I'm like there perfect or anything like that, but that's the gold standard, is organic no-till. And I'm guessing people in this room are the types of people that are kind of open to trying that. So when you're thinking about terminating, a lot of large-scale producers will just terminate with an herbicide, and I'm like, that totally defeats the purpose to me of planting a cover crop. You're then just coming in with a chemical disruption. So think about something that you can easily terminate, and that's why I kind of like buckwheat, because it's a really juicy, easy to like just bend over stem. I've actually taken like a board, like just a wooden board, drilled a couple holes in it, put a rope, and then you basically hold that rope and you stomp on the board, and then you move it forward, and it's totally feasible on a small scale. It's almost the same idea as like crimp rolling. So the other option for cover cropping is to find something that will winter kill. So basically like a buckwheat and oats. You can use all sorts of things for cover crops. You can really get creative. I mean, I just take my old garden seed, you know, like you have all those seed packets at the end of the year, or just like things you're like, I'm never gonna plant this, or I bought this like a couple years ago. Just mix those all together, as long as it's not something you have like disease problems with. I wouldn't put a tomato or if you get those, you know, if you get those like spots on your beet leaves or whatever, I wouldn't throw that in the mix necessarily, but you know, throw anything, your brassicas if you don't have brassica diseases, or your lettuces, carrots, whatnot, mix them together and just broadcast that around and see what you get. I mean, you really can experiment with it. It's all about being creative and coming up with what works for you. No two gardens are the same, so what works for me or someone else, or even just your neighbor right next door, is not necessarily gonna work for you. So with cover cropping, think about your niche, think about your goals. What is your goal? Is your goal to cover the soil to prevent erosion? Is your goal to smother weeds? Buckwheat is actually allelopathic, which means it prevents germination of weeds. Just by virtue of it being in the soil, it prevents other weeds from germinating. So those are the things I would think about if you're gonna try to incorporate cover crops, and you can get small amounts of buckwheat seed or oat seed, peas, and try mixing a few things together. Peas and oats is a natural spring cover crop that you can just broadcast out, rake it in lightly, and then terminate it however you want to do that, even just by mowing, and then plant your tomatoes right into that, and you've got like a living mulch right there. I mean, something just try different things. So the handout I have on cover crops has a few ideas. It lists the different cover crops, what their purposes would be, gives you some ideas on which niche you might be looking at. So cover cropping is one strategy. I mentioned perennials. So don't be afraid to throw some perennials right in your vegetable gardens. Plant some perennial strips, whether that be asparagus, strawberries. I've heard someone that put their strawberries and asparagus, just mix them right on in together. I plant a lot of herbs, medicinal herbs, perennial herbs that can be mixed right in, and those have the great benefit of attracting pollinators. Hazelnuts, blueberries, think about like perennial shrubs that produce nuts or fruit. Since I'm on such a small scale, I didn't want to plant a lot of large perennials, so I planted more shrubs. So that's another great strategy for incorporating the soil health principles. I mentioned the tarps that I use. This is a technique called occultation, which occultation refers to the absence of light. So basically what I do, you can use silage tarps, you can use whatever you have around. I mean, even like a piece of like plywood would get the job done. If you've ever left a piece of plywood sitting in your lawn, you know what happens. It kills the grass. And so what you do is you put the tarp over the area, and if you're starting with like lawn and you're like, I want to convert this to garden, think in advance. So now even, you know, get your tarp out there now, or in the fall or midsummer. And in the absence of light, the plants are not able to photosynthesize, so they actually germinate, and then they die, and then you're left with an area that hasn't been disrupted by tillage. And if you've tilled a section in your garden and you would like to try to get away from that, you can do this. I do this to areas that are already in production. So it's not just a way to start a new garden bed, this is a way to prepare the soil for a new, or for an existing garden bed as well. And I got like recycled billboards actually. I think I went to it's just like usedbillboards.com or something like that. And you can get them in all different sizes. I didn't want to just like go buy a big piece of plastic, so I was like, what can I get that's a repurposed thing? And they're pretty durable, and yeah, I just drag them around my garden and weigh them down with whatever, you know, objects I can find as best as I can to really keep the light, keeping the light out is the key to that technique. There's also solarization, which is the opposite, where you basically take a clear plastic and put that down and like burn the weeds basically. I mean, both techniques have potential challenges, drawbacks, etc. But again, it's all about experimenting. How long you leave that tarp in one spot depends on the temperature, it depends on what your goals are. You can peek under there and see what's happening. I just moved one that I had in place all winter, like a week ago, and saw kind of what was under there. It kind of helps. If I've got tall grass, tall organic matter, crop residue, I'll just pull it right on over that, weigh it down, and it flattens out completely, you pull that off, and you've got some kind of almost mulch-like stuff, crop residue, just on the ground there. Other techniques and tricks. Does anybody else have anything you've tried in this vein that you'd like to share with the group? That you've tried soil health practice, maybe any reduced tillage methods or a creative idea? Okay. Yeah, definitely. Any mulch that you can add. I mean, I'm sure we are all gardeners. We know how great mulch is. It just makes life so much easier. It holds in the moisture. It prevents weeds. The only thing to be aware of with mulch is just, you know, you want there to be sufficient airflow so you don't get diseases, fungal diseases or things like that built up. So if you notice some weird stuff going on with your straw, maybe just fluff it up with a fork or something like that. Anyone else tried anything interesting or? Mm-hmm.
I haven't tried anything, but I'm asking. You were talking about buckwheat that that's wheat. Have you ever heard anyone tackling and successful?
Getting rid of comfrey? I have it on good authority that that if you have comfrey somewhere, that it will just be there probably forever. Yeah, if you're gonna plant comfrey, you choose carefully where that's gonna go. No. Buckwheat's more gonna prevent like the germination of like a weed seed, not like a root spreading. But that being said, comfrey can be used as a soil amendment. You can use it as, you can just like mix it with water, let it ferment for a few weeks, and use it as either a foliar spray or like a root drench, and it's actually a good soil amendment to do that. Or you can even chop up the leaves and use it as like a mulch. So it does have good soil building properties. So if you have quite a bit of it and you want to repurpose it, there are options. But yeah, getting rid of it, I've heard, is not really feasible. Mm-hmm.
We literally have a good huge
All comfrey.
And so it's a perfect place for a garden and everything, but every uses of comfrey.
Right.
Like, we just want the spot.
Okay.
So, but I'm kind of hearing now a couple times that you know what.
I was gonna say maybe trying the occultation. You may need to leave that tarp on it for like almost a full year before you'll really get rid of it. I mean, it might even take more than that, I'm not sure. But I think that would maybe be your best option, just because eventually you'll starve out those roots from producing food, and they'll starve eventually. So that would maybe be your best option. Burning usually just like promotes, oftentimes burning will promote growth of certain things. So I don't think that would probably get rid of it. So how are we doing on time? Do we have a little bit more time? Or are we about at time? Okay. Oh, okay. So the one last thing I'll just briefly point out is, okay, so I mentioned I brought some resources, and one of the resources that, and I don't think I have enough here for everybody, but it's just free available on the Sustainable Farming Association website, is if you're interested in different ways of measuring, and even if you don't go through with the soil health tests, this might be kind of an interesting read, or if you have kids that are interested in science, this could be an interesting thing to do with them, but there's the Soil Health Toolkit test directions, and these are, this isn't a replacement for lab testing, but these are 4 tests that you can easily do at home with materials that you have on hand. You probably won't need to go buy anything to do these. There's the infiltration test, which measures how quickly water is absorbed by your soil. There is the slake test, which is a really good visual way of assessing like how well your soil would respond to a heavy rain event. There's the pH test, which is a good starting place just for the chemical component of soil, and then there's directions for the earthworm test. But the earthworm test is just something easy. You can observe like how many earthworms are in my soil. There's also a report card. So if you want to get really fancy and keep records to track improvements in your soil, like try something and see in 3 to 5 years, am I getting better results? There's a report card that you can then, it has all of the fields there that you can just fill in to keep track of those tests. So that's just available. If you go to you just Google or whichever search engine you use, the Sustainable Farming Association, and then go to the soil health page. Oh, is it? Okay. That's right, yep, exactly. If you go to that page, so you could either just type that link in directly, it's got the soil health principles right there for you. If you click on soil health, it brings you to, I mean, this is just one resource on there. The cover crop, this is the cover crop, I can pick it up. The cover crop resource that I mentioned is also available on there, but I do have some hard copies. I'm more of a hard copy type of gal, so if you're interested, you can check those out on the website there. So that was about all I wanted to point out as far as resources. I mean, there's, like I say, there's a lot on that website, but I think the best thing to do is really just experiment and see what works for you, be creative and enjoy. I mean, it's much more enjoyable for me to use the soil health principles than to be applying, you know, fertilizers or herbicides or pesticides. So this is just kind of, I like the guiding principles as a framework to then go try different things and get a little bit creative and come up with a system that works for me.
Once you've solarized or killed your cover crop, how do you recommend building a seed bed and with like a soil, or how do you need some way to loosen the soil to get your seeds in there? What do you recommend, or how do you do it?
So there's different approaches you can try. Like I say, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. One method would be creating like a raised bed with, I mean, I do this just with like a shovel. If we're on a garden scale, it's not unreasonable to just kind of dig and then flop that soil right over on top, rake that out, and then you do get some loamy, more loose soil that you could more reasonably seed into. Like just forking and loosening, like I use a broad fork. It's kind of like a double wide like digging fork that you just kind of stomp into the soil, loosen, and then you're not mixing, you're just loosening vertically. I mean, depending on, once you get to a certain point, you're gonna find that you have good soil structure without tilling. You're really not gonna need to like till to get a seed bed. What I'll do is take, I don't even know what it's called. There's a little like garden tool. It's just like a little triangle. I mean, it's just kind of a little type of hoe, and just drag that in the line where you're gonna, you know, you just make a furrow basically in the ground, almost like a strip tillage, but on a very micro scale. So you just create a furrow in the ground and drop your seed in. So it might take some time to get to the point where you don't need to do anything to really like create a seed bed. But once you're using these practices over time, you'll see that the structure will just greatly improve, where you're not gonna rely on tillage to get nice deep roots. There's even one cover crop option is called like a tillage radish. It's actually a radish that you plant that gets really big, and that's like, you know, creating those big cavities in the soil to really loosen your soil. So I'm not sure if that's on here, but yeah, that's not listed on here, but this does have some suggestions for a cover crop that might help with like heavy soil. So does that answer the question enough, or are you still you still want to get the tiller out and really make that nice seed bed? Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you're gonna plant a carrot, maybe use the broad fork and then kind of rake over that and then create that furrow, and that will really create a nice, I mean, it is a little bit more work up front, but once you get the system in place and you have the soil functioning, it actually makes life easier, because you're not bringing weed seed, you're not bringing it to the surface. So you're actually not gonna have as much weeds ultimately germinating. I know people worry about how do you control weeds without tillage, but you're actually eventually gonna get to the point where you're not gonna have as many weed seeds sitting on that soil surface. So it's a process, and I suggest kind of trying one thing at a time. I mean, don't get overwhelmed and feel like you need to do all of this all at once, like get out your tarp, get out your broad fork, like throw away your tiller, like, you know, maybe try one bed where you use your tiller, and then next to it try a different technique and see, you know, the difference. So I think, are you going to talk about compost? Yeah. Yep. Any other questions? I'll stick around for the discussion as well, so yeah.
Is there any manure that you would avoid or that you recommend? I mean, is there?
I'm a big fan of using what is on hand and available, and I will say that there's a right and wrong way to compost manure. If you are spreading manure, I mean, food safety comes up, because you obviously don't want manure next to a crop that, like a fresh lettuce, you're gonna be eating. Food safety regulations, if you're like a farm operating on a larger scale, I think you're supposed to spread manure like 200 days, or I can't remember, it's something like around the neighborhood of 200 days before you harvest that crop. But if that's raw manure, but if you get from, it's been turned, I mean, people who are technically doing it right should have a certificate that says that they're doing it the right way, which involves like windrowing it, turning it, getting it up to the proper temperature. Once they get it up to that proper temperature, that will kill the harmful microbes and weed seeds. So kind of a balance between using what's readily on hand and trying to find a high quality product. You know, it kind of depends on your situation. So I don't recommend any certain animal or type of manure, or, I mean, I think cow manure is what most people use. Chicken manure, if you have chickens, why not, is really great as well. I think some people use like the turkey litter and whatnot, but just making sure that either it's properly composted or you're applying it far enough in advance of before you're gonna harvest that crop to eat. So, and that's especially important if it's something that's gonna be sitting on the ground. If it's something that's trellised or growing more upright and not touching the ground, it's not as big of a food safety risk, but still something to think about. Mhm.
So I'm thinking we have like 3 acres of dandelions blowing around our yard, and we might increase some of our garden space.
I can hear you, yeah, I'll repeat the question. So sometimes weeds are present because of a nutrient deficiency. They almost work as like a feedback loop. You can tell a lot about your garden and your soil based on like what weeds grow. There's a really great book called something without poisons, like growing without poison, or managing weeds without poisons or something like that. But I think dandelions can oftentimes be like a calcium deficiency. So you could look at amending the soil to try to help get that down. But
Or I was wondering if your garden really fence, we still have that from the rest of the yard. It's gonna be a big job to get everywhere, whatever it was. And ocean around it.
I don't have a problem with dandelions. They're like the first, I mean, they're really not that bad. I mean, the worst part about it is my neighbor's pristine lawn with 0 dandelions, and then mine with thousands of dandelions, but they're the first food source for bees in the spring. I mean, when there's nothing else for the bees to have, the dandelions are there. And like, yeah, they're gonna spread a little bit via like seeds, but they're not gonna like creep in your garden via root division. And when they seed themselves via weed or via seed, they're not difficult to get out of your garden because they're not that deeply rooted. So if your concern is just like that they're gonna spread into your garden, I don't know, is that happening or is that becoming a problem? Or? Sure.
So I'm imagining, oh yeah, there'll be less weeds, so I'm thinking my garden will be full of weeds.
Yeah.
But you're saying the light board, like the board itself.
The occultation with the tarps would definitely help.
But as you have your garden growing,
Yeah, I mean, I'm still doing a good bit of hand tool cultivation and things like that. I mean, it's not complete absence of disrupting the soil surface. So I'm still doing a bit of cultivation, but I've noticed the types of weeds that I have changed over time, and the ones that do come up oftentimes are not, I mean, they're keeping some of, like last year, a few weeds was not the end of the world because of how dry it was. I mean, it's actually kind of a good thing to have some weeds, and I think the important thing is just to get the plants to the point where they can compete with the weeds. So once the plants are big enough to compete with the weeds, I'm not so worried about like total eradication, other than if they're about to go to seed, then you want to get rid of that before it goes to seed. But just to have like the foliage or just to have the weeds present, I mean, think about if your garden had no weeds in it, that'd be a sign that there's like not great soil fertility. So it is a balance between keeping the numbers down, but you know, keeping them from going to seed is the most important thing. So if you notice that they're about to go to seed, then yank them out by all means. But if they're not at that point yet, or if the vegetables are at the point where they can compete with the weeds, then it's not as, and like some weeds, even like purslane, when I see purslane, I don't worry too much. I mean, it's like super high in omega-3s, which, I mean, you could go to the store and spend a fortune on salmon, or you could just go out and, you know, make a purslane smoothie and get the same benefits. So, and it's nice and juicy, it's a nice little ground cover, so Yeah, it's not, total eradication isn't necessarily my goal, but it depends on what your goals are. I mean, maybe you want a pristine looking garden, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you can, it's your garden, so you can have a weed-free garden if you want, but you might be missing out on some of the ecological services that those weeds are providing. So I want to make sure we have enough time for the other presenters. I know we went a little bit over, but I hope that's okay.
It's really great hearing all you have to say, so isn't she great? Thank you, Sarah. And we'll hopefully have a little time at the end for more questions as well. So, and then I just want to say that, you know, the SFA, the Crow River chapter, is our area, and they are a really great resource. You can check out the website. There's great resources on the website. Sarah has a video, I think you mentioned that, about with the soil tests, and then they actually have a podcast as well called Dirt Rich Soil Health Podcast, and that's really good too. So why don't we go to the next, and then I also want to mention this webinar that someone brought up to me, and I've actually seen other webinars by the same organization, and this one is free, and they're, you know, they are trying to pitch, you know, the non-free classes as well, but there's a lot of great information in these webinars. And Dr. Elaine Ingham, if you've ever heard of her, she is a world-renowned, just top expert in soil microbiology, and just hearing her speak, I mean, you will learn so much. And then the other people that they bring into these webinars are have a lot to share too. So they're very good when it comes to learning about soil health. And so, okay, why don't we go to the next one? And so I'm here to talk about worms, and my presentation will probably be kind of short because I've just started with them in October, so I haven't really been doing this for all that long. But I want to hopefully just show you that it's really simple. It's something you can do at home, and it's something that you can use to compost food scraps year-round. Really easy to do. But the power of worms, just to illustrate, just share a couple stories. So there was a 10-year study in Austria that showed that a blanket of compost covering a 10-year-old 65-foot deep landfill reduced methane emissions by as much as 100%. Okay, and this is better than the designed traps for methane, which are only, you know, 70 to 85% efficient. So yeah, so they're great for purifying the air, much like houseplants. And then another example is, let me show you this book too. So everything that I'm going to tell you about worms comes from this book. So if you really want to know, you know, everything there is to know about it, or most of what there is to know about it, I really recommend this book. It's called Laverne's Handbook of Indoor Worm Composting by Ellen Sandbeck. And she's actually the person I bought my worms from too. They were mail order worms. She's up in Duluth, and she just mails them to you. It's $35 for a pound. It was in October, plus shipping. But anyways, another example in her book, there was this study, can't remember where it was. I think it was in India. But this hospital, or these researchers, took all this infectious waste from this hospital, just full of, you know, salmonella, E. coli, all sorts of bacterial, strep, just nasty stuff, full of it. And they had two bins. They had a control bin, and then they had a bin with the worms, and they composted this hospital waste. It was all biodegradable, just, you know, gooey bandages and stuff like that. And so, but they found that after 12 weeks, the bin with the worms was completely free of the pathogens, which is amazing. And the bin without the worms was, you know, all that yucky stuff was just still thriving. So the worms just can neutralize, you know, those pathogens. So if you're worried about like composting eggshells, I wouldn't be. So it's okay. And so earthworm castings contain bacterial and fungal populations 100 times higher than that found in average soil. So talk about adding biology to your soil. You know, these red wiggler worms are the type of composting worms that I'm using. you can really add a lot of those microbes to your soil with this type of composting. A 2002 study of yields of various crops, tomatoes, peppers, strawberries, showed that in vermicompost treated plots versus inorganic fertilizer treated plots, the vermicompost treated plot yields were consistently and significantly higher. And then plants treated with vermicompost have also shown to have greater pest resistance. So, all right, next slide, please. Thank you. So the setup is really simple. You just need a container that's at least 12 inches deep. I like this deeper tote here because then I have enough room to just dig a hole and kind of put the compost, or, put the, stuff I'm digging off to the side. Otherwise you can just put it in a bowl or something, or a bucket, when I'm adding, scraps to the bin. A synthetic rope, and you can see in the picture, so I drilled a hole at the front of the bin, and then you just tie a knot in this thick rope here, and then just pull that through. The knot just helps keep it in place. And then you need sand, a layer of sand and gravel, because like chickens, they need that grit to help digest the food. And I use peat moss. There are other materials that you can use that she lists in her book, but I just bought a bag of peat moss from Menards. And with the peat moss, you do need to dampen it before adding it to the bin. Worms don't like to be dry. In fact, they can't survive if they're dry. And let's see, the idea with the rope is that once you get enough liquid, like composted liquid in the bin, it'll wick down through the rope, and then you can collect that worm juice into a milk jug, and then you can use that, the compost tea, and that's like jet fuel that you can put on your garden. But you really have to dilute it. It's like 20 parts water to 1 part worm juice. Or if it's a crop that doesn't need as much fertilizer, like legumes, for example, you dilute it even further. All right, so next slide, please. And then you need leaves or shredded cardboard or brown paper. And I use leaves, but that's your bedding. So you have 2 inches of leaves on top as your bedding. And the leaves are also good, or that brown matter is also good if you have really wet food scraps, like melons, watermelon, for example. You don't want your compost pile to get too wet and slimy, because that's when it can turn anaerobic, and that's when it can become more acidic and be more inviting for non-beneficial microbes. So, and then you just put a black plastic bag on top, and I'll show you here, and that helps keep in the moisture, and it helps block the light, because red wigglers don't like light. The UV rays of sunlight can actually harm their skin. And then of course you need worms, which I got through the mail. So Laverne's worms, again, is where I got them. And she has been doing this for decades. And she set up, she's done very large scale setups, like at the federal prison up by Duluth. She set up a 100-foot bin for the prison camp up there. And she said that in the first 67 days of setting up that bin, they composted 10,000 pounds of food. So it can really take a lot. Yeah, so, and I have 3 of these bins, and why don't we go to the next slide? Oh, actually, stay here for a second. If you have cats, it's good to have a lid. You don't need a lid otherwise, but they'll think it's their litter box. So a lid with holes is handy then. And let's see, so a bin this size, you probably want to think of it as in 4 sections, and rotate which, section you're adding to. And, gloves are kind of nice, especially long gloves. In fact, I would probably prefer even slightly longer gloves too, but it's so simple. All I do is I've got my compost from the weekend, or my scraps, and she even says that you can compost small bits of meat. but I don't usually do meat. But I mean, all the veggie scraps, banana peels, you know, eggshells, I save in this bowl, and then when I feel like I have time, I go down to my basement, and why don't we go to the next one? Okay, so for location, it's good to have a cool spot because they can't get too warm. And she, Ellen, who sells the worms, she wants to talk to you before you order worms from her. So you cannot order online. You have to call her and talk to her, which is really good because I learned a lot from talking to her, and I was going to do things all wrong, actually. So it was very good to talk to her, and she's very, very willing to answer your questions. But you need a cool spot, a room that doesn't get above 75, because the compost, of course, gives off heat too, and they can't get too warm or they'll die. I talked about the UV rays, not too dry, so not near a humidifier, of course. Unfinished basements are perfect. That's where we have ours now. But even under a kitchen sink, in a closet, a heated shed or garage can work too. So you can get creative there. But it just has to be cool, dark, and you know, not by a dehumidifier. So, but I just want you to see just how easy it is, you know. So when I peel this away, I can see that there's moisture under here, which is good. If there isn't, then I sprinkle a little water on here to keep it moist enough. And I push aside the bedding. Oh, I can see a worm right here. And I just dig a hole. I know you can't see this, but so I just dig a hole. And it was interesting because the first week that I got the worms, and I had my bin, and I was adding compost, and after the second, you know, the next week I went in to add more compost, and I kept digging, and I kept finding my food scraps, and so I'm like, okay, this bin hasn't quite come alive yet. So it takes time. Now, 4 to 5 months later, you know, a week after adding my scraps, I dig around, and I can't find my scraps. They have disappeared. The worms have eaten them up, and the other microbes that are in my bin now eat up those scraps really quickly, so it's really cool. And so I just, you know, I just make a hole, and I make sure not to dig all the way to the bottom, but far enough down, and then I just, you know, I add my scraps in, and I crush my eggshells, and I'm just going to do a little bit right now, but, and then I just kind of sprinkle a little bit of the peat moss or the finished compost around with it so the worms can get to the compost more easily, and then I just, it's probably easier to see this in the video, but, and then I just cover it right back up, and I just make sure that there's at least 2 inches of material, like fine grained material, the peat moss or coffee grounds, of that on top of the scraps, because otherwise you'll get fruit flies. And then the dirt also acts as a filter, so it doesn't smell, you know, unless you improperly bury the scraps, which I have done before, and I had lots of fruit flies. So you just have to bury it 2 inches, and then cover it back up, put your leaves back on. If it's too dry, I add a little water, cover it back up with the plastic, and voila. And so it's really simple. And I'm not at the point yet where I'm getting worm juice through the bottom, but I hope to get to that point. So that's pretty much it. And maybe let's see what the next slide was, if I had anything else. Okay, and there's where my 3 bins are in our basement, and I just have the rope going to a milk jug down below, and I just have it propped up in an old table that happened to be in our basement. So, pretty simple. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah. Yep, oh, go ahead.
The sand, you got sand and
Yep.
something that stays in the bottom.
Yeah, you can just put a layer of sand on the bottom, and sometimes I'll even just mix it in with the peat moss, but just a little bit. They just need a little bit of grit. So, just a little bit grit for digesting the food, kind of like chickens, you know. They need the pebbles or grit, so to digest the food. Yeah.
So when you're ready to that soil,
Mm-hmm.
how do you get it out of there without any worms? Or do you get a new batch of worms every?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you can just dig out what you have. I mean, you know, just dig out some, and then there is a way that you can get them to like move to one side. You can just add the scraps to one side for a while and then leave this side to finish, and then the worms will just kind of migrate to the other side. If you want to take like a larger amount of compost out, you could do it that way. So yeah, otherwise you can just take a little bit out at a time and maybe shake it for worms, I guess. So. I originally had them in the grow room, and so I have some grow beds in there, so I have used it on there, and the plants seem happy. So I'm assuming it's helping, but I haven't done it for very long, but this plant seems to be going strong. So, yep. Yeah, Jay?
Are the bedworms compatible with regular soil outside? Let's say you got the eggs or whatever, and you're incorporating your compost,
Yeah, that's a good question. I've heard that they are not native to Minnesota, so you don't want to like take them to like an old forest or something. But I've heard that they also will freeze during the winter, so they'll just die if they're out in your garden. So I suppose they would be beneficial for your garden, you know, for the summer, and then they would just die when it freezes. So, and another thing, the red wigglers are supposed to be the most efficient composting worm, and she says that people have tried like, you know, your regular garden variety earthworm and they haven't had much success. So the red wigglers are really a good way to go. Yep. I want to say for this, she recommended like a pound for this size bin, and then they'll reproduce quickly too. So I mean, you could start with just one bin and then, you know, grow from there over time. Yep. Well, I guess originally I was trying to get rid of our scraps. So I was trying to do that just to be more sustainable. But I mean, I'm also doing it now for the soil. So I'm excited to, you know, try applying this in the spring and summer, so. Mm-hmm. Yep, Jay. It was $35 a pound. I put tons of citrus peels in here. Yeah, so I put in a bowl's worth like every 5 days, and yeah, there's lots of citrus peels and yeah, eggshells and so it's amazing like what I have put into this bin over the winter. It's just like disappeared. So it really works well. Yeah.
So does the volume not really increase that much over time? I mean, I know when you compost outside, it seems like it almost does it.
Yeah.
Does it ever like increase the volume of compost in it?
I really haven't noticed it increasing very much. I think there's just a lot of water in the food, and I just noticed that with dehydrating now too. Like I can't remember what I dehydrated, but I was like, oh, zucchini, you know, went from like, you know, a giant zucchini to like basically nothing, like a piece of paper, you know, so there's just a lot of water content. So I think, yeah, I haven't noticed a big volume increase. So, and she did say it takes like 27 gallons of food scraps to make 1 gallon of finished compost. So it really does shrink down a lot. So. Yeah, I don't know. You know, sometimes I'm kind of busy or lazy, and so my compost dries out a little bit by the time I get it in there. So, but I bet like come summer when we have more like melon and stuff, it'll probably be juicier, I'm guessing. And then it took me a little while to learn too. It's like, oh, I really need to add more water, you know, during these dry months too. So, but yeah, I hope to have more juice eventually. Yeah, I just kind of crunch them up in my hand. Yeah, yeah, I'm amazed when I just kind of sift through the compost. It's like, I don't see any eggshells in here. So, okay, I better let Becky go. Becky's up next. And just to introduce Becky, I don't know if she needs an introduction, you probably all know who she is, but she's at Dan and Becky's Market, of course, and she's just a wealth of knowledge and a wonderful, she's gonna wave me off, wonderful, just sustainable living role model and leader, I feel like, so everybody listen up to Becky.
I read a lot, and I finally learned I have to start doing it. So, first off, I'm going to show you, this is probably the most important tool I got when we decided to compost more seriously. It's a thermometer. So, sticking that in the compost pile, I don't do bins, I just do piles, is important, because then you know that you've killed your weed seeds or your pathogens. And it's a lot of fun to watch how the temperatures change. I am going to get out some notes, or I'll be all over the place. I have different resources here, and it's not possible for me to do one subject at a time. I'm a very holistic thinker. So, compost is one string, and once you pull it, you start incorporating everything in life. I do have some papers here with, I'm very low tech too, I like paper, sites you can go to watch videos. I like to read, I like to see a video, and then I like to do it because then it imprints in my brain. I'm going to start with, what is a compost pile? And you know what, it changed as I was doing my reading. There are different, my first definition I got was a pile of items, which typically carbon and nitrogen, that heat up and produce a quality product to improve soil fertility and seed the soil with food, the soil food web. But then you have to go to the science. Compost is a process where energy is removed from the carbon structures and minerals are consolidated. Compost is an organic fertilizer. I think a lot of times we confuse compost and mulch, and it's good to distinguish. Mulch maybe can be a fertilizer, but typically it's a ground cover and you're holding in moisture and whatnot, but compost is a fertilizer. That second definition is from John Frank, and he's in Fairmont, and he is a he's a chemist that has become a soil scientist, and he has a business now doing that. Making compost, I can give you a formula, but it ends up being different for every single person you read. A lot of people use equal parts of green and brown material, and we'll get into a little bit more of what that is. Other people use 3 parts brown material, 1 part green material. And then it's important to add a shovel full of either dirt or if you already have a pile of compost. This kind of jump starts your process. Water is another really important ingredient. You want to be able to squeeze your compost once you've gotten gotten it put together, and 1 or 2 drops of water will come out. If you have a lot of water dropping out, you're going to encourage pathogens, and you're going to encourage nutrients being lost through the water flowing through the pile. One thing you need to remember, well, I'm going to talk about 2 different ways here. You can start with piles of many different ingredients. Your green material, maybe some green grass clippings, kitchen scraps, maybe a little bit of manure, but I don't typically mix kitchen scraps with manure. And then a pile of carbon, which can be dried leaves, it can be dried, very dried grass clippings. Some people use straw. I wouldn't use it unless it's very finely shredded. It's the same with the leaves too. You want them finely shredded. And I just mow it over with the lawnmower. I imagine some people use a leaf chipper or a leaf shredder, but that's not something I have. One thing that you think of as a brown product, but is actually green, is coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are a nitrogen source, and they really help jumpstart your compost pile if you're short on nitrogen. And you can just add your coffee filters in with it, and that's a brown product. The goal for a compost pile, even though you can have smaller ones, the best size compost pile is actually 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. Then you know you're going to hit the temperature of 120, between 120 and 170. You can do it you can do a smaller, but I think you have to watch it more. With the 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet pile, you've mixed in your green materials, your wood chips. I always keep a pile of wood chips or leaves at the side that you can add, because often you need more carbon than you realize. And then every time you add, say, kitchen scraps, add a little water. Make sure that you're keeping things moist enough for the microbes to grow, but not too much for the pathogens to grow. And then in 4 or 5 days, check the center of your pile. You should see that, actually I would start checking it the 2nd day, but by the 4th or 5th day, your pile should be up to 140, 160 degrees. I typically haven't gone over 160. When it's to that temperature, it's time to turn. And then you take the outside of the pile, which now you want on the inside to heat up, and the inside of the pile you want on the outside, because that's encouraging the whole pile to break down. The temp will gradually start rising again in that 4 or 5 days. You can turn it again the same way, and then when it gets down to 110 is actually when you can turn it. So you can turn it every 4 or 5 days, and in a month's time you will have finished compost. That's the simple version. There are different types of compost we do, and I'm sure there are probably people here that do it better than I do, but I have one bin. It's 3 foot high, 18 inches square. it's how you're not supposed to compost. That's where I put a lot of my scraps from the kitchen, because it's not far from the back door, and it's just easy to deal with if I'm not gonna bring them all the way to the chickens, or if it's maybe some things that the chickens don't appreciate, especially potato peels, things like that. In that compost bin, it sits in the middle of my rhubarb. And I add a shovel full of dirt maybe once a year, some leaves once in a while, shredded egg carton once in a while. So it really doesn't have enough carbon in it. It's mostly nitrogen, but my theory is the moisture that is coming from it, and because it's sitting on the ground, there are a few worms that come up and eat it, and it's giving some warmth and nutrients to my rhubarb patch. And I think ever since I've started doing that, my rhubarb comes up earlier than it used to and produces earlier. Now, there are other types of compost that we do because we have chickens and cattle, and that's where most of our compost is. And I like my chickens to do most of my work as far as composting. I literally take all my kitchen scraps that I haven't put in my little bin and throw them in to the chicken coop. In the wintertime, they're in the coop. In the summertime, they have a coop, and then they're inside a fence in the pasture. But still, I'll throw scraps from the store. We get a lot of produce in that maybe is iffy, can't be put out for sale, so then it goes to the chickens. And so they do get a lot of greens and produce throughout the year. But then I'm not dealing with it either. I get to deal with it after they've scratched through it, eaten it, and pooped it out. We typically, in one mobile coop, we have wood shavings that we use as the bedding. We have a structure that I just call the hoop coop. It looks kind of like a greenhouse. I have chipped wood in there, and a lot of it's larger, so it takes longer to break down. So I also, and that's part of their winter coop, and then there's a little outside area too. So they have 3 areas that they can go into, and I throw scraps or spent straw, hay, whatever, into all of them, and then that gives them something to do. Chickens love activity, and bored chickens can be crabby chickens. This time of year, I'm starting to clean out my coop, and it goes to an area where we keep our compost piles. It will sit at least until next fall to continue breaking down. I have a jar here that I took out of a pile that has thawed out enough, and this is last year's bedding from the chicken coop, and it basically is dirt. This was just a pile of wood chips, and if you come up later, you can see that it's still a little more chunky, but there was no nitrogen added to it, but these were fresh chips that were put into a pile. So I will use this maybe in between rows of a garden bed, or around some flowers or tree or bush, something, but more as a mulch than an actual fertilizer. with our cattle, you get 50 pounds a day of fresh manure. And that is on top of all the fresh urine. The thing about having the urine is, unless you have good bedding that it's going into, you're losing a lot of the nitrogen pretty quickly. And in the wintertime, we will have our cattle in the pasture where we put round bales, and they eat most of it, but then spread some of it around, and then that is full of urine and manure, and that is also building our pasture soil. Then we also have, at this time of year and in the fall when it's muddy, we take our cattle off the pasture, put them in a sacrificial pasture up by the barn, and it's horrible now. I mean, it's everything you don't want in composting because of the snow melt and whatnot. So even though we may add in spent hay and straw, it's not enough right now. So you can smell some ammonia. It's not rank, or it's not putrid like some places are. I don't mind it, but a lot of people aren't used to that. But we have a cow and a calf that's separated from the rest by a fence that have the ability to go in the barn. So we have that spent hay and manure that is being put in a pile and is starting to do some composting. But once we get the cattle out of there and this area that has built up with manure and spent hay and straw, we will go in and scoop some of it out and build another pile in our compost area. And that will sit for a year before it is used. And then another pile we have a lot of wood chips. A few years ago, whenever I would see a chipping truck going around town taking down trees, I would immediately stop and say, if you need a place to put those chips, I've got a place for you just down the road. And it worked really well, but people discovered it's a good deal, so we can no longer get wood chips from anybody unless somebody has some extra, because it's gotten to be a popular thing to stop and ask the different companies if they can have a pile of chips dropped in their yards or on their farms. But we have a son who decided to get a chipper. So now we have access to more chips again. And because we butcher chickens on the farm, and we have on-farm sale butchered chickens, we need something to do with all the offal or the guts. And composting it works really well. We layer, eventually you have to turn, but not always. You layer chips on the soil, and then very thinly put a layer of the chicken offal, and sometimes the blood and the feathers, and then you put a thick layer of chips on, and you keep on building. And that, in a year, sometimes 2 years, depending on how big the pile is, will end up like this. Occasionally you'll see a chicken bone if for some reason there was a broken wing or something, or a foot, a chicken leg that was in there, but we have too many people that want to buy the chicken legs for broth and stock, so we don't lose those too often. Another thing that I do use in making composts are comfrey, and I'm a huge fan of comfrey. I understand the spreading because we had a gopher spread some of ours that was not supposed to be spreadable. But mulching it, I hope tarping it works. And maybe even the solar tarping would work too, because that has a really deep root. And all it takes is a teeny tiny piece of root and you have a new plant. But I cut down my comfrey 3 or 4 times every summer, and I use it either as a mulch or in compost. It actually kind of gives a boost to compost, or in a tea. And I've let it sit for 3 or 4 days and used it, but then I've also let it sit for several weeks, and it really stinks. But it's another thing where you use a lot of water and just a small amount as a foliar spray. I've even used it on my apple trees. And I often add stinging nettle and burdock leaves to that mixture too, because you have so many nutrients in those plants. Are there any questions? Yes.
When you build say your 3x3, like in the summer, say you're making in the summer and it's the rainy season, you put cover on it at any time?
We haven't tarped it, but if you're having a lot of rain, it might be a good idea because you don't want everything leaching out. We haven't had enough problem with the rain, and because we have so many compost piles and we have so much wind at our place, it wouldn't work. But if you have it in a protected area, it will often work if you are in an area or you're getting a lot of rain that season. Anybody else before? Go ahead.
You've got a bigger compost pile. Mix it up that way,
You know, once compost piles get bigger, that's the way they're done. Commercially, there are a lot of cities that have commercial composting, and it's done by big fancy machines that turn it. And we have used a tractor and a bucket too. Like Sarah said, sometimes you just have to make it work for you. You can't do everything perfect, so you just have to make it work. And composting, I think people just get into their own rhythm, what they have. To me, chickens is the way to go. It's the way to solve a lot of our garbage problems. But not everybody is into having chickens. But I do have to say that using the compost as a fertilizer, most people overuse it. It's so tempting. That compost looks so nice, and just have it a foot thick and think you're just going to plant in it. Well, it might work for a while, but eventually it's going to have issues because it's just so rich. I know that in lawns and pastures, often they just spread like a ½ inch or an inch of compost in order to feed their soil. It's just like a boost to get things going. I'm sure there are a lot of different scientific formulations, which I know there are. Elaine Ingram, her classes are amazing, and it's really interesting listening and understanding how the soil works. I discovered that soil is very much like our own personal microbiomes, and that you kill those, you kill yourself, you kill soil microbiome, you're killing the soil. So it's very, very much the same thought process. And with Elaine, I think she's probably so smart that she scares people off. But if you're interested in science at all and you have access to a microscope, she has a great class on using microscopes and then discovering what's in your soil and what's in your compost. And she also teaches composting tea. She also teaches a lot of people to go out there and help farmers and help smaller, maybe vegetable farmers, figure out how to use the system, because it can be really intense. It's so scientific. And then John Frank from Fairmont, he focuses more on small garden growers, which he has a lot of free content too, with the idea that he's going to be able to sell the amendments that you need to bring your soil back into balance. And whereas Elaine Ingram's focus is on microbiology, his is more on minerals. They both cover everything, but you often follow one path that you're really interested in.
I know you mentioned composting, is it the release of energy that makes it up, or what is happening right?
It's the release of energy in the carbon. I was all excited because I was learning, oh, you should use the ramial branches. It's the smaller branches of the tree, the ends where you've got all the growth happening. And when you chip those up and, you know, add them, you'll have all this power. Well, I was reading John Frank, and he says, absolutely never use those in a compost pile. It's like, oh, I thought I finally learned something new. He only uses that as a mulch. But he discovered that because the 8 acres he lives on, in his grove of trees, the grass was growing so well, but yet, even though there was a fair amount of shade, but out in the open area, the soil was hard and the grass was sparse. And what he discovered through research was it was the ramial wood chips that were causing the growth. And then if you really want to have fun, you learn about biochar and how you can put that charcoal in your compost pile and it boosts the nutrients even more. That I'm just on the very beginning journey of, but so it really is endless. Yeah. We move it around, and we learned that the hard way. There was one spot that we were always putting the bales in, and that mulch got so deep that it would not thaw out and it would not dry out in the spring. So you're better off, some people, if they have enough cattle and land, they put bales out in the fall over the whole pasture, and then they string wire in between the bales, and then you open up and do one at a time. That works really well. The part we haven't incorporated very much is adding chickens to it, in the spring, because then they really kick through all of that mulch and break down on the patties and eat all the fly larvae. So it really does help. We did have one big pile by the barn that we composted right there once, I think it was 2 years ago, and I just put my chickens in there for about a month, and it sits on the hill, and those chickens kick that whole pile of compost down the hill, which is what we needed, because we need to reshape that hill because of some dirt work that was done there years ago. So yeah, it works really well, and a lot of farmers are taking the bale and actually rolling them out so that they eat pee and poop on it. If you have a really bad pasture, that's probably one of the best things you can do, because it just provides a lot of protection for the soil until the biology can get going. Yeah, I'm not. It's a great idea in Florida. We have one because we got a deal, you know. They freeze up in the wintertime, and then you've got this lump of frozen stuff. I'm sure if you're very disciplined and faithful and go out there every day and add enough carbon to it, and you might be able to make it work, but I'm not a big fan. It's a great idea because we have a son living in an area where there are bears, so it'd be great if they could use that to protect it from the bears, although I don't know, bear could probably knock it over. But for us, it's just not working. It's frozen too long. Mm-hmm. I think I'd be mixing things together, because you just don't want, yeah, because the carbon is holding things in there. I'm sure I probably don't understand the whole process there enough, but I think I would definitely be layering, and then once everything thaws out, then start flipping it over and making the ratios more correct. Okay, they have kitchen scraps in a pile waiting, and should you start composting it right away or mixing it in with things, or just leave it wait for spring until you have all your carbon and nitrogen ready to make a pile?
Totally different.
So I would say you kind of have to work with that and figure out what works, especially some people can do it undercover in an open shed or something like that, and it might work one way or the other. But if it has to be outside, I think I'd want it covered, because you're gonna encourage critters.
So, all residential, only 2 people.
Mm-hmm.
So mostly substantial that you have.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at my compost is about that big, but I have it outside.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm probably freezing mine out because it's not getting.
In the wintertime, it's not really doing much. I've noticed that my compost bin it was so full I couldn't add anything more to it except for coffee grounds. And now it's down about 3 inches. So it is starting to break down some, but I would definitely go this route if you have that opportunity. That's a much better way to get rid of kitchen scraps. There's one of the guys that I have, did a TEDx talk down in Arizona, and his philosophy is all you need to compost is leaves, and if you happen to have coffee grounds, great. He doesn't believe in kitchen scraps in compost at all. He said definitely vermicomposting, and then just he composts leaves and coffee grounds. So you literally don't need more than that.
Understanding when you're talking chickens, are you saying give them your scraps and
Yeah, everything that's in there, because you know, underneath their roofs, it builds up so much, and you have to add so much wood chips in there. So the extra kitchen scraps that you throw in that they don't eat are going to continue to compost down. Although it's surprising how much they eat. It's not enough for their nutrients because they need more carbohydrates and protein than what's in just vegetables. But that being said, there is Vermont Composting. It's a huge company. He has municipal kitchen scraps that are separated out, and he composts them with wood products, cardboard, whatnot. He does not have turners. He has chickens, and he has like hundreds of chickens, and they scratch down those piles, and he gives them very little extra to eat because there's so many microbes that grow in there, and they can see a microbe that we can't see. So they're getting a little bit of the food from the chicken scraps, but most of their food is the microbes. So that's another fascinating thing that it'd be interesting to figure out more, but none of us have that much. And I'm not going to go driving around picking up people's kitchen scraps. So. No, yeah.
So, thank you so much again, Becky and Sarah, for
If you want to look at any of the books, a lot of it is philosophy not philosophy, but it's the holistic thinking. So mycorrhizal planet. I've just started getting into this one, and it's fascinating. So, and then other books that kind of get you going for your philosophy of composting.